The Deathworlders, a story by user Hambone. Chapter 17, Battles, Part 3. Date point, 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Isberg. Planet, Isberzerk. Kirk. Isberg's architecture was a study in graceless off-white concrete cubes, ruddy and austere in the sullen red light that penetrated the great force-field dome. That dome made Isberg a city with breathable, oxygenated air, rather than a sand dune and a gasping death followed by erosion under the relentless sandstorms. Still, somehow, the sand and dust crept in, and was swept into the cheaper, poorer districts, where it accumulated until somebody was finally motivated to organize a crusade against the cloying orange powder that rounded out every corner, and undulated across the road in the stiff artificial breeze of the atmosphere systems. For once, the human predilection for clothing seemed like a sensible concession to hostile environments, rather than a strange cultural peccadillo. The grit between Kirk's toes was chafing him terribly, and he was devoting his upper hands full time to shielding his eyes from airborne dust, whereas Julian and Allison were both wearing high-laced tan boots, sourced from Army surplus back on Earth, and seemed perfectly comfortable inside their hooded jackets. It was only when he glanced sideways at them that he realized they were both wearing dark sunglasses and some kind of flimsy white mask over their noses and mouths. If not for the subtle differences in body shape between male and female, he wouldn't have been able to tell them apart. "Could I have one of those?" he asked after his third sneezing and coughing fit. Julian wordlessly produced one from the pocket on his leg and handed it over. "You can try," he said. Kirk held it over his nose and tried to inhale. It was difficult beyond belief. "I think I'm using it wrong," he said. "It's just a filter. You're using it right. People wear these things all the time back on Earth." Kirk tried again. It was like trying to inhale through a wall. "They do?" "Sure. I hear you can get them with, animal faces and stuff printed on them over in China." Kirk handed it back. "How can you breathe with this thing on?" he asked. "Deathworlder?" "Of course, Oh, good. This is the address." "Your old friend likes the lowlife," Allison commented, surveying the street. The nearest garbage pile contained pieces of automated garbage collection drone. "Far from it," Kirk told her. "But he's a practical being behind the diplomat." "Diplomat?" Allison asked. "This guy's from your Security Council days?" "Before that, even. He and I go all the way back to the Outlook on Forever, long before it was famous. There, that's the building." "You sure? It looks pretty much like all the others." "It's the only one with a big enough door." They ducked through a swirl of dust and paused on the opposite side of the street, where Julian looked up and tensed, ready to leap. A hand landed on his shoulder. "Nuh-uh, Mr. Jungle. It's my turn to be the badass." Allison sprang up the wall, grabbed a cutaway that was the closest thing to ornamentation on the bland gray building, and swarmed up it in the low gravity. Kirk watched and admired as she turned at the top, and caught the bag that Julian threw her, an item which he himself had trouble even lifting, but which the Deathworlder lobbed up to roof height with one hand, and only a small grunt of exertion. "You sure we need that?" Julian asked him. "I tied that mercenary up pretty good." "Chinasho mercenaries don't get a reputation like hers, without being almost as dangerous as you are," Kirk said. "She underestimated us last time. Let's not make the same mistake." "Makes sense." "What did you bring for yourself?" Julian just tugged his jacket aside. Hanging from his belt was a knife as long as one of Kirk's hands, and a hatchet. "Just the essentials," he said, almost apologetically, as if he wasn't carrying weaponry that could bring down a Vulza. Knocking on the door produced no effect at first, but then, just as Julian was about to ask if he was sure they had the right place, the door, sealed against the invasive dust, popped and freely swung inwards. They stepped inside, and Julian closed the door behind them, squinting to see in the darkness inside. Something glowed an unwell yellow-green in the far corner. A voice spoke, quietly, as a heavy bulk around the glow shifted.
Unorukvoyong. Ulohugoagnu. Akentenziktik. Lun.
Vedrig. Oh, Vedrig, what did they do to you? Kirk rushed forward.
Lu.
The big being chuffed deep in his chest, something similar to a laugh.
Morogvulon. Morgutu. Morgutu morulugo.
Vedrig shifted as the light came up, and Julian fought back a sudden heave in his stomach. The Govnorag's great shaggy scalp had been shaved, and terrible, ugly wounds covered it, the blood a startling blue where it soaked his dressings. "You did this to yourself?" Kirk practically shrieked, clearly appalled.
No. Sorunguvuran morulu gugwan fatwag.
There was a shocked silence, during which Kirk only stared at his old friend, and Vedrig turned his head away, flanks fading from shade to shade. Julian eventually had to ask,
What's he say?
Kirk looked up at him. He said it was the only way to escape them. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Folk the Colony. Cimbrian. Captain Owen Powell. "Captain!" Ross was at a dead run from the direction of the sensor array. The cobbled-together menagerie of technology that Adrian Saunders had installed had been one of the first projects in the colony to be housed inside a permanent structure, where it had been added to, patched into a series of monitors, and generally turned into the beating nerve center of the colony's intelligence network. "There's a ship coming in, sir. 5 parsecs out. Looks like a freighter. Straight at us." He reversed course and matched the captain as Powell ran toward the sensor array and landing platform, handing him an earpiece.
"Legsy, drop it and gear up,"
Powell yelled. Legsy had already paused his demonstration as Ross approached. Now he snapped out of jocular instructor mode and into hardened Special Forces veteran, pausing only long enough to acknowledge the order before heading to the armory, long legs eating up the turf. Powell got his earpiece in and keyed it.
"Myrmidon, ground has incoming contact. Looks like a civilian freighter. Can you see it?"
he asked. "We do, Captain. It's still too far away to make out details, but it's big, it's slow, and it's using a warp drive. Agree that it looks like a freighter."
"Have the hunters seen it yet?"
"There's been no increase of chatter on their channels to indicate as much. If our best estimates as to their sensor range are accurate, then we should see them start to take notice in about 5 minutes."
"Any way to contact them?"
"Not until they're in range for the swarm to see them, and they're too slow to escape. It'll be a massacre." Powell gritted his teeth. Watching the escape pod arrive a fortnight earlier had been tough. That tiny vessel had stood no chance in hell, and had been scooped wholesale into the belly of a swarm ship that had decloaked like a breaching whale and swallowed the little craft whole. He weighed his options. It could be a trap, a stolen freighter full of the toughest and best-armed hunters that the swarm of swarms could muster, in which case any rescue mission would most likely end in death. But what rescue mission could they realistically pull off, anyway? Potent and reinforced as they were, neither of the salvaged hierarchy ships would stand up to the hungry enemy at their gates. He explained as much to Captain Manning as he entered the groundside CIC, familiarizing himself at a glance with the latest updates as the sensors teased new information from the unfolding situation. "We may have a solution there," Manning replied. "It's a risk, but I'm not watching a freighter full of people die on my watch."
"Assuming it's not a trap,"
Powell reminded him. "I'm prepared to take that risk, Captain."
"I was hoping you'd say that. What's your solution?"
Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Isberg. Planet Ikberzik. Allison Bueller. "Hey, guys! That mercenary found us!" Allison settled in under the cloak that Julian had so thoughtfully packed into the bag. It wasn't much. In fact, it was little more than rough sacking, but the color blended with the concrete and dust of her rooftop perfectly. At most, she would look like a tarpaulin left on the rooftop storage to keep the dust out. Here, in a place where it never rained. Reinforcements? Julian asked her. I see 5, not counting that Zokrup bitch.
Only 5? I smell a rat.
Allison took that seriously. Julian was a blushing disaster with women, and a heck of a lot of fun to tease and flirt with, but she also knew that he had an unrivaled instinct for dangerous situations. I can't move without risking them spotting me, she said. I can see the whole road, but don't ask me about the alleys.
Leave that to me.
One jungle's pretty much like the other, huh?
Better. No sticks to break. No snakes to step on.
There was a pause. Allison had no idea how Julian had exited the building, but she had every confidence that he had somehow.
Okay,
he finally said, as the mercenaries continued down the street, knocking on doors and intimidating the frightened, impoverished residents who dared, or were coerced, to open up.
Alleyways are empty. Weird.
They can't be that overconfident, can they?
Not after what we did back in the market. Not if they've got a brain. And I'm thinking Zokrup does.
Allison watched the Chinasho in question remove something slimy from a facial orifice, inspect it, then eat it. Oh, yeah, she's a shoo-in for Mensa.
Oh, shit, stay down.
Allison did so, burrowing back from the edge and down under her cloak. After a second or two, her ears caught what Julian had heard, and she tucked herself up as small and unnoticeable as she could manage, just peeking over the top of her wall. Something that reminded her of a crane fly came skimming low over the rooftops and spun gently above the middle of the tree. Allison blinked as it kicked up a real wind to replace the half-hearted synthetic breeze, full of particulate irritants. Kirk chimed in. "What's going on out there?" he demanded.
"They brought a gunship," Julian said. "Don't show your face or it'll level the building."
"Wrong," Allison said quietly.
"What do you mean, wrong? I'm looking right at it."
"They brought 3. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Series base: Sol. Drew Cavendish.
"You've reviewed the code already?"
5 of the IBM senior engineers were in the meeting, and they collectively shared the patient expression worn by all engineers when dealing with the layperson. "Yes, we reviewed the code already. Completely. It's simple and efficient code. That was the whole point. Now that we're all here," Adele Park drew their attention to the arrival of the Drews. "Let's get this thing started. How's your guy, Cavendish?" Drew sat down.
"He'll have some scars to show off, but he's okay. Thanks."
He meant it. Being asked that by the base's executive officer was genuinely a balm for his damaged morale. "I'm glad." She tapped something on her tablet computer. "All right. Meeting is called to order. In the chair is Adele Park, Executive Officer for Series Base 1, the Hephaestus LLC. The business being discussed is the critical incident of this date, its causes, effects, and how to prevent a repeat. Are there any points of order before we begin?" Drew raised his hand. "Point of order, Mr. Andrew Cavendish, Dig Site 1 team leader," Adele said, then extended a hand to indicate he could proceed. Drew cleared his throat.
"Adele, it's high time we hold a meeting concerning all of the serious, significant, and critical safety incidents that have befallen this facility since launch," he said. "This is only the most recent in a string of potentially deadly mishaps, and we've seen no trend in improvement in response to our efforts to improve facility safety."
"While not strictly speaking a point of order, the suggestion is well made," Adele said. "The motion on the table is to expand the remit of this meeting to cover all safety incidents since the start of operations. Is there—" I see several people raising their hands to second the— In fact, motion carried. Drew had already placed his thick incident folder on the table in front of him, unnoticed. Now, as he pushed it forward toward the center, everybody looked at it.
"We may be at this for some time," he said.
Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Isberg. Planet Ikberzik. Julian at Sicily. They brought 3. No sooner had she said it than Julian saw them. It was overkill by anything's standards. Each of the gunships put him in mind of a sturdy metallic spider, a segmented body housing the engines, pilot, and gunner, and 4 long but solid legs each of which terminated in a coil gun. Devastating firepower aimed at one target, or the ability to separately handle 4 different threats. Still, there were some obvious design flaws. The kinetics were mounted high on the outside of the hull, making them an easy target, and the body didn't look like it was armored. The whole assemblage bobbed and swayed in its own airwash, suggesting that it was a bitch to pilot and a nightmare to shoot straight, especially if the gunner was handling 4 different targets.
"Right," he said. "We've got one big advantage on our side."
"Do tell." Allison sounded nervous.
"No thermal camera or any kind of advanced sensors," Julian told her. "If they had those, they'd have seen us both already and locked on, so we can ambush them."
"I could shoot out the engines." Julian considered it. The biggest and heaviest thing in the bag had been their gun, an Israeli Star 21, the designated marksman version of the Tavor assault rifle. Chambered with the 5.56 as it was, and Allison being the shot he knew she was, that was probably a sure kill against the exposed and unarmored engines.
"People live here," he said. "I don't really want to drop a crashing gunship on Ma, Pa, and little baby Vizkitik."
He shrank down as one of the Chinasho mercs sauntered past his alleyway hiding place. The other 4 and Zokrup weren't far behind him, and a crappy plan came to him. Awful though it was the only one that presented itself in a timely fashion. The band were dangerously close to knocking on Kirk and Vedrig's door.
"See the one on Zokrup's far left?" he asked.
"Yeah."
"Shoot him."
Allison didn't acknowledge the order, but a quiet second later, there were 3 thump sounds, and the selected Chinasho fell bonelessly to the dirt in silence, with a shocked expression on his face, and a large hole right through his center of mass. The alien snapped into formation, aiming in the apparent direction the attack had come from with commendable efficiency for aliens. By human standards, they made the laughable mistake of completely failing to watch their backs. Julian didn't even bother bloodying his weapons. The second none of them were watching the alleyway, he dashed out, and 2 of the mercenaries were killed by the simple expedient of slamming their skulls together, with a noise like a pillowcase full of potato chips being used for a piñata. He slapped the third a lethal blow upside his greasy head left-handed as he moved, still astonished at how flimsy non-humans were, and threw his hatchet with the other hand. Even though the merc's shield emitter robbed the flying axe of most of its momentum, it still embedded itself in the frog person's rib cage with enough force to lift her off her feet. It took only 3 or 4 seconds to go from the moment that Allison shot the first victim to the moment that Zokrup was struggling in his grip with a hunting knife pressed to her throat. "Holy shit, Atsicity," Allison said, clearly impressed.
"I'd call off your gunships,"
he advised Zokrup, pressing just hard enough to draw blood. The hovering craft had turned their coil guns to face the carnage, and he was acutely aware of staring down the barrel of one of the few forms of weaponry out here in the galaxy that was truly dangerous.
Yes, yes,
she agreed, and Julian congratulated himself on the way his half-baked plan had actually worked. She raised a hand to press at her earpiece.
"Gunship 1. Shoot us."
Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Folktha, planet Cimbrian, the far reaches. Gaiotin. The problem with being the most fluent speaker of English in the little non-human enclave the crew had built for themselves was that Gaiotin constantly found himself thrust into the role of spokesperson. Surrounded as they were on all sides by Deathworlders, his crew, and as the senior ranking member of that crew, he now thought of them as his crew, had naturally walled themselves off a little, building their own habitation out of sight of the bustle of the colony proper, in what he knew the humans were calling the ET quarter. He wasn't sure if the term was degrading or not. Still, staying in touch was necessary. So, he represented the non-human perspective at the Thing. He had the ears of Governor Sandy, Captain Powell, and Chief Ares, and played his role in the development of this illegal little operation. He was even beginning to like it, though he only admitted as such in his most introspective moments. There was one building that fascinated him in particular, though, and what was fascinating was that it had been one of the very first the humans had built. They called it a faith center, From the outside, it was built of the same mix of local wood and imported materials as any other building in Folktha. But the plan was different. Most of the others made efficient use of the space, packing as much as they could into as tiny a footprint as they could. Decorated, yes, but rarely to any enormous degree. By comparison, the Faith Center was a large and ornate glutton for land, its own footprint supplemented by a large plot of it. It had interested him since the day they built it. But this was the first time he had worked up the courage to enter and inspect this curious Deathworlder edifice. He poked his head in the door, finding it, surprisingly, considering its obvious importance, apparently empty. The main doors led into a central hub, which was a simple, open, airy room full of comfortable seats, throw pillows, bean bags, and bookshelves, and desktop computers, doubling as the town library. The doors in its 7 walls led into a variety of spaces. He inspected the books. They seemed to be segregated according to topic, but it wasn't clear to him exactly what the difference was between topics. One of the shelves was full of books with titles like Knowing God, The Purpose-Driven Life, and Grace Abounding. There were several copies of something called the Holy Bible, but the only word he recognized of those 3 was the. Another held books marked the Quran, the Messenger of Allah, the Spiritual Teachings of the Prophet. He spent some time exploring, frowning at book titles like Bhagavad Gita, Tao Te Ching, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. That one earned a double take. The God Delusion, and In Defense of Common Sense. He wrestled briefly with the mystery of why Letter to a Christian Nation was not on the shelf clearly marked Christian, and the conundrum presented by Living Buddha, Living Christ, which as far as his hypothesis up to that point had decided, were 2 different things, whatever they were. He gave up on the books, deciding that there was no insight into human strangeness to be found from just glancing at their covers, and that he didn't have time to read any of them, and turned his attention to the doors set in the remaining 6 sides of the heptagonal hub. One led into a little corridor which contained only 2 other doors. He didn't understand the symbols on them, but a quick investigation soon cleared up that mystery. Plumbing was much the same the galaxy over, and it turned out that human privies were not dissimilar to Gowan ones. Next door to that, some small rooms, one containing a table and chairs, one containing what was obviously a water heater, a refrigeration unit, and some basic food preparation equipment, and a third door which was locked. The next room was a real mystery. It was effectively empty, containing nothing but a handful of ornate little rugs. There was something written on the far wall, but it wasn't in the alphabet used by English. It was while puzzling over this one that he finally heard some sign of life, and he looked around to see the 7th door swinging shut. Eager to get a human explanation for all of these mysteries, he dithered for a few minutes, rehearsing his introduction and request before finally poking his nose through. This last room was only marginally less austere than the rug room, containing little but chairs, a large table at the front, and a lectern next to some kind of electronic device that he couldn't immediately identify. The only decorative thing within it was the window behind the table, which was tall and narrow, neatly bisecting the wall, and intersected 2/3 of the way up by a shorter perpendicular line. The glass was densely pigmented, making it all but impossible to see through, but casting dazzling colors into the hall as the sunlight shone through it. At first, he didn't see the person who had entered, until he advanced forward slightly, and saw that she was kneeling on the floor towards the front of the room, hands clasped in front of her face. He began, rehearsed greeting forgotten. She jumped, immediately going tense, and Johnathan mentally chastised himself. Humans were Deathworlders, with an immediate fight-or-flight reflex of terrifying speed and efficiency, built right into their nervous system. He'd forgotten, after so long of seeing them in their domestic peaceful life, that he was dealing with a truly dangerous being here. "Sorry," he squeaked, acutely aware that he was still figuring out their contradictory mess of a language. "I didn't mean you make jump." He thought about this, then realized he'd defaulted to Gowan syntax. To make you jump, he corrected. The girl, and she was still just barely a cub. He knew enough about humans nowadays to spot that much. Relaxed and smiled, setting his skin crawling at the sight of those sturdy teeth. It's okay, she said. Hey, I've never met a non-human before. Well, then, hello. I may come in? I'd like that, she nodded. You're Gowan, right? Right. I am Johnathan. Clanless, for now. Ava Rios. Johnathan tilted his head slightly as he approached. Ava's eyes looked redder than was usual for a human, and there was moisture on her cheeks. He'd never seen an expression quite like it, and with Ava lacking a corresponding translator to communicate her body language, he had to use his best guess. Are you all right? He asked. It seemed like a safe bet. She sighed. He knew that one, and stood up, dusting off her knees. She surprised him by being slightly shorter than he was. Johnathan was small by Gowan standards, and Gowan standards were small by human standards. I'm an idiot, she said simply. He blinked. You are? I mean, why say that? I ran off at the mouth. One thing Johnathan had got his head around with humans was the way their analogies worked. They seemed to love idiom and metaphor and weave it into every facet of their conversations, subconsciously. A more straightforward species might have said, I said some things which I now regret having said. But he had to admit that I ran off at the mouth got the same message across both more swiftly and more evocatively. That happens, he said. You did this to friend? Clanmate? I don't have a clan. Ava looked up at the window and shut her eyes. Johnathan saw a water droplet run down her face, which she wiped away with a sleeve, before returning her attention back to him rather abruptly. My boyfriend. Your mate? Close enough, I guess. We're together. She turned away from the window. Hey, can we head outside? Those beanbags looked comfortable, and I think they had hot chocolate. If you like, Johnathan agreed. There was an atmosphere to the room that was starting to encroach on him, a feeling tickling at the roots of his fur. He had no way to describe it. He shivered the sensation out as he crossed the threshold. What were you doing there? He asked. I was just praying, asking God for help, she said simply, and confessing. Johnathan sniffed. I don't understand, he said. Confessing what to? It's a Catholic thing, she said, as if that explained anything. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned, you know. Catholic? Your father and sinned is what? I guess you don't know, huh? It must be a human thing. I guess, maybe. I've never really thought about it, Ava said. Do you want an Ovaltine? Johnathan summoned a term he'd heard. I'm game. Don't know what it is, but I'm try it anyway if you want. He sat down as she heated up some water and poured it into a pair of handled cups, alongside some brown powder. The resulting concoction turned out to smell incredible, and when he sipped it experimentally, he added it to his list of reasons why human weirdness might just be a good thing. All this, he indicated the room and its books. So alien. I think sometimes humans very strange. Ava looked around at them. I guess. I mean, wow. That's a lot of books. She sipped her drink. Don't ask me about it, she said. I just went to church every Sunday. Why? Because that's what we did, Ava said lamely. Because you've got to thank God. That seemed very strange indeed to Johnathan. Deciding that Ava may really not be the person to ask about these things, he changed the topic. You don't seem like idiot to me, he said. Say what? Ava asked, thrown by the conversational tangent. You said, I'm an idiot. he reminded her. Why? Ava thought about it for a minute. I guess I don't really know. I just said some really stupid and hurtful things to Adam, and I don't know why. I was just so mad at him, and I don't know why. What did you say? Johnathan asked, congratulating himself on getting the syntax right. She shook her head helplessly. If nothing else, Ava was a good lesson in human body language. You'd have to know us pretty well, I guess. I told him to go run to his dad for advice. Johnathan scratched behind his ear. That is stupid? He asked. If he need advice, talk to a father. Common sense. I told you'd have to know us to get why it's a problem. Johnathan imitated a human shrug for her benefit. Or maybe it's not a problem and you just... Oh, what word? Confuse? Unexpectedly, she laughed, a little strangely. Oh, God, don't say that, she protested. That just makes me feel more stupid. Johnathan was still trying to plan how to respond to that when Ava took her turn to throw him by going off on a tangent. Hey, I just noticed you're naked. What? You're not wearing clothes. Well, no. I usually have covers for pockets and things, but didn't need today. Is problem? No. For some reason, this seemed to amuse her. No, it's not. She set her cup down, then unexpectedly leaned over and kissed the top of Johnathan's head. His ears tilted downwards, half out of confusion and half so as to make room. Thank you, Johnathan. You're like a furry Zen master, you know that? Johnathan wasn't really sure what he was being thanked for. Thank you? He asked. Any time. Ava got up. Her mood apparently very changed. She seemed happier now. I should go. Will I see you around? I'd like that. But first, what is Zen? I saw books over there have that word. Well, why don't you read one and find out? She asked. Johnathan considered the suggestion for some minutes after she left. He cleaned up the dirty mugs, and when he returned to his cushion, he had one of the books in his paws, which he opened and took a few seconds to skip the preface and forward. He turned straight to Chapter 1 and began to read. If I am asked then what Zen teaches, I would answer Zen teaches nothing. Whatever teachings there are in Zen, they come out of one's own mind. We teach ourselves. Zen merely points the way. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Isberk, Planet Ikberzik. Allison Bueller. No! Suicide. The alien hellbitch had suicided rather than accept surrender, and she'd taken Julian with her. The alien gunner didn't hesitate. Julian only had time enough to register the order, but not enough to do anything about it before the coil gun fired, pounding a crater in the street that turned Zokrup into a rain of vile greenish-brown chowder and filled the air with dust. Bereft of any better ideas, and with tears threatening her vision, she shot out the engines on all 3 craft. None of them even figured out where she was before they fell out of the air on cut puppet strings of smoke and fire, smashing into the road and half demolishing some poor local locale's home. She didn't melodramatically empty her magazine into the burning wreckage. Instead, she set the weapon aside and began to climb down the building, unsure why. It was just an inarticulate noise of pain and nothing more, but an unmistakably human one. Not a scream, just the low, creaking moan of a man in agony. Julian! She was rewarded only with panting and heavy breathing on the open channel, but she knew where he'd been standing and, more importantly, knew that he was still alive. She grabbed the bag and vaulted off the building, dropping the 2 stories to the street below and rolling easily with the landing, a feat she never could have managed on Earth. Julian was in bad shape. It was at least easy to identify which of the blood was his and which was Chinasho. They were very different colors. Zokrup's last act of defiance had actually saved Julian from her own vengeance. The token resistance offered by her disintegrating body had spared him the very worst of the blast. But his legs were still peppered with gravel shrapnel, and Allison doubted there was anything she could do for his left foot. But his torso seemed undamaged, and the bleeding was manageable, especially with the state-of-the-art instant dressing foam that was part of the medic's kit they had brought with them. That, plus sticking the oral painkiller lollipop under his tongue, was about the limit of her medical ability, however. "Heck of a plan, Atsicity," she commented. He laughed, apparently already getting on top of the pain.
"Didn't quite go how I'd planned it," he admitted. "Who the fuck kills themselves rather than lose like that?"
Kirk tiptoed delicately past some of the gunship wreckage. "Somebody who is dead anyway unless they win," he said. "Julian, I'd ask if you're all right, but I can see that you're plainly not." Julian rested his head, teeth gritted.
"They got doctors on this planet?" he asked.
"Of course.
"Good ones?"
You get what you pay for, but we can pay a lot."
"Good. Then give me a minute or two for the painkiller to really kick in. We can go get me patched up."
Kirk took Allison to one side. "How is he really?" he asked, once they were probably out of earshot, though Julian's ears were well honed. "I don't know," she admitted. "I mean, I was a barista before I was abducted. I don't know shit about this. I think he's pretty bad." "Can you carry him?" "In this gravity? No problem." "Good, because I need that doctor as well. And so do you." "We do?" "Yes." Kirk looked around, raising his long neck to get a clear view along the street, looking toward where Vedrig was hauling his mauled body out of his safe house, then back down to Allison. "We need to get these implants out of our heads." Date point: 4 years, 8 months, 2 weeks after Vancouver. Salvaged hunter dropship, Cimbrian, the Far Reaches. Captain Owen Powell.
"Last check, lads. That freighter's going to hit the spike in 2.
Redundant though it was, the team double-checked their gear, accounted for all their magazines, tested their earpieces, and signed off ready.
"Hey, Captain,"
Legsy said.
"Yeah?"
The Welshman grinned behind his mask and sang out part of an old football chant.
"Who are we?"
Powell chuckled.
"Strength and fucking guile, mate. Too bloody right we are."
Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. HMS Myrmidon, Cimbrian, the Far Reaches. Captain David Manning. The plan was, in theory, a simple one. Planet Cimbrian's larger moon had been home to a dragon's tooth from the moment the system had been militarized, as had several other locations across the system. Between the fading moon's mass, the tooth's own wormhole signature damping field, and the impressive cloaking technology installed by the original owners of Myrmidon and Caledonia, their jump to the staging point had gone unnoticed, and from there, warping in to lurk near the incoming freighter's expected arrival point, had been relatively trivial. Not bad for a half-baked plan conceived in a rush. Even deploying the scavenged dropship into the heart of the swarm had turned out to be much easier than they had feared. Space was too dark and empty for much to be seen of the intense space-time distortion as the gravity spike was deployed. Even when the hapless bulk freighter slammed into the distortion at several thousand times the speed of light, the most that showed for it on any visible spectrum was a slight moving of the stars, like rocks under a clear stream. On other spectra, the reaction was instant. Huntercom's chatter tripled in volume and intensity. Even set on passive detection only, the hierarchy sensors recorded all sorts of information of uncertain significance. Neutrino bursts, ES field sweeps, dozens of ships decloaked at once, among them a formation of dropships identical to the one Powell and his men were riding. A few tense seconds ticked by as the first major failure point was met and tested. He got the call he was hoping for. "No sign of any weapons fire between hunter vessels, sir." Their deception had gone unnoticed, and he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he watched the little craft descend on the struggling freighter, latching on and burrowing into its outer skin like a cloud of mosquitoes. Now came the real challenge. It was absolutely critical that under no circumstances should the larger ships be allowed to engage with the freighter. If the hunters got wind of what was going on, they might well just pulverize the ship as it flew and scavenge their coveted pound of flesh from the debris. "Weapons tight. Go active. Cloak off, all cleared hot." A patch of apparently empty space solidified, and HMS Myrmidon pumped 12 Skymaster rounds into the largest hunter ship, which had begun lining up to pierce the freighter with its boarding proboscis. The first 4 were enough to drop the shields. Great plumes of powdered metal and condensing air marked the impact sites of the remaining 8 as they smashed into the flimsy alien heat dissipation armor, which was totally unequipped to deal with 30mm HE rounds. Something broke deep inside the target ship, and suddenly it was listing and rolling in the eerie silence of vacuum as half of its dorsal hull peeled open, spilling the crippled vessel's pressurized guts. The bridge, and Manning knew that the CIC would be even more intense, erupted into a controlled chaos of crew shouting terse, jargon-dense updates to one another. Myrmidon had several advantages over the hunter craft, quite aside from the fact that the aliens seemed ignorant of the possibilities of electronic warfare. There was the huge edge granted by having guns which were built around a completely different technological paradigm, against which the hunters seemed to have no defense. Her capacitor power reserves allowed her to shunt huge amounts of energy into her engines, and her crew had the physical tenacity to put up with what were, for a ship equal in size to an ocean-based cruiser, violent high-G maneuvers. God willing, they wouldn't need to test whether their durability was up to scratch. He heard the call he had been waiting for 12 seconds into the fighting, while the hunters were still confused and reacting sluggishly to the unexpected foe that had them in enfilade and was taking remorseless advantage of it. "Teeth seated!" He knew what that meant. It meant that all across their own hull, explosive blisters had burst, flinging out hundreds of Dragon's Teeth wormhole beacons in all directions. The battlefield was now, and would remain for several hours, a place of infinite flexibility for any human ship. He felt the slight lurch in his belly as Myrmidon completed her first jump, displacing 300 kilometers just as the first hunter vessel lined up and fired a flurry of coilgun rounds at where she had been. The offending vessel caught a Skymaster volley in her engines for the trouble. "Cells at 80%, somebody called. They had another 50 before Doctrine called for Myrmidon to immediately disengage to recharge. But waiting her turn behind them was Caledonia, who would seamlessly transition into the battle as they left. It couldn't last forever. They had only minutes before the full might of the swarm caught up with what was going on and bore down on them, and against that many ships, no amount of ducking and weaving would suffice. The clock was ticking. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Isberg, planet Ikberzik. Kirk. The nearest doctor turned out to be one of Kirk's own species. She was taking a nap on her own surgical table when they burst through the door. "What? Who are... a human? A wounded human?" "We are all patients, sister," Kirk told her. "But my friend here needs your attention first." She took a look at the mangled mess which was the end of Julian's leg and focused. "Get him on the table." The scanning equipment above the table started to chirp alarmingly, the second Julian was in place. The doctor muttered as she reviewed it. Yes, dangerous microorganisms, but he's got the suppression implant." "What in the name of Recklesotic is this poison flooding his system?" "Fentanyl citrate," Allison told her, trusting the translator to convert the terms into something she could use. "How much?" "About 400 micrograms." The doctor stared aghast for a second. "That's 5 times the lethal dose." "For most species, maybe," Kirk said. "But I assure you he is quite safe. I suggest you focus on the injured limb." "I'd heard the rumors about their physiology, but—" Julian laughed, clearly a little spaced out. "Doc, I'm fine. Can't feel a dang thing." "Doctor, the leg." She looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. Oh my, yes, I'd better." She examined the wound briefly, then shook her head, in the slow, long-necked way of her species. "I can't save the foot. Nor do I have the equipment to hand to build a prosthetic which would be adequate for a human." Just so long as he will live and heal, Doctor, Kirk reassured her. We have a lot to ask of you tonight, and tending to his wounds will be the less strange part. She ushered them toward a marked waiting area. Then leave me to work. What will be the more strange part? Every one of us wish to have our neural cybernetics removed or disabled. She stared at him. Brother, why? What reason? She leaned forward slightly and studied his face. Wait, I know you. The politician. Ex-politician, Kirk replied. And I value my anonymity and that of my friends, Doctor. 10 Dominion development credits would allow you to upgrade from this clinic into a hospital. Bribery, brother. Yes, Kirk said flatly. Bribery. This is important. She gave him a calculating look. 12 credits is a wonderful donation to the cause of healthcare in this impoverished community, and I thank you for your altruism and charity. 12 it is. The doctor looked up and off into the distance of her personal heads-up display just long enough to see the funds transfer into her financial network, then nodded again. Very good. Now step back and wait your turn, please. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Refugee freighter Cimbrian system. The outer reaches. Captain Owen Powell. A quick glance round the corner. Some swift hand movements. Blitz, shoot, check, clear, repeat. It was high-speed, aggressive warfare. Exactly what Powell and his men had spent their careers training to excel at. In every compartment, the hunters knew of the SBS team's presence only long enough to register being shot, and often not even that. They had already been too late for 3 poor bastards. The first was impaled to the wall by a vicious metal spike, clearly fired at high speed straight through his throat. One had been sliced to ribbons, taking 4 of the sickly white beasts down with him before they carved him apart and paused to feast. One woman was still thrashing and dying from nerve jam, blood frothing around her mouth and bitten tongue. Her murderers were denied their taste of her flesh, at least. Legsy mowed them down just as they were stooping over her. It was in their 5th compartment that they rescued their first, a burly, bald man firing back at the hunters with a pulse gun from behind a table, despite where one of the spear chuckers had put a burnt gouge in his arm. "Oh, fuck! You're human! Oh, you're human, thank God!" "Quiet and listen," Powell ordered him. "Aft compartment 5. Get in the hunter dropship with all the human gear inside and stay there. We've got others to save." They moved on. He would have only hindered them. There was a lot of ship left to clear. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Starship Sanctuary. Landed on planet Ikbrazik. Allison Bueller. "They were once known as the Agrayans." Vedrig seemed to have responded well to the doctor's attention and had regained some of his usual animation and poise. The rest of them were looking and feeling thoroughly disheveled, sporting newly shaven patches on their scalps, and anesthetic hangovers. Allison in particular had needed a quadruple dose of the doctor's preferred general anesthetic, and was nursing a plastic tub as she sat and listened, looking decidedly green around the gills. "I suppose they still are, deep down, but the Agrayans as they exist now are very, very different to the species that once dominated our galaxy." "How do you even know about them?" Allison asked. She would have killed to crawl into bed and sleep off her headache, but with their implants gone they needed to have the conversation here aboard ship, where the sanctuary could translate for them, and Vedrig had insisted on it happening immediately. "Their existence is ancient history, distorted a little bit by the passage of time, but preserving data parity is a prerequisite technology for interstellar travel. Our archives were inherited from those who came before us, who inherited their data from the ones before them, and so on." "And so on? How the hell many and so ons are there?" "Some tens of thousands." Vedrig used the number nonchalantly, as if it was common knowledge that tens of thousands of life forms had been and gone before.
Civilizations rise and fall in deep time. The records referring to the Agrayans and their arch-rivals extend back more than a quarter of a grand galactic rotation. Naturally, much about them has been utterly forgotten.
Kirk spoke up. To be more precise, about 65 million Earth years. Wait, I'm still hung up on this and so on thing? Tens of thousands? It was so strange to see Kirk make a gesture and not have the knowledge of what he meant by it just come to her. His body language was different, alarmingly so. She could no more read the motion he made with his hands than she could interpret Vedric's bioluminescent pulses. We're not the first species, Allison. Nobody has the first idea who was.
Even the Agrayans apparently had their own records, going back and back and back.
Vedric added.
The inherited archives are immense. A whole society could labor at delving their secrets and barely finish the index before their time came to an end. While storing the yottabytes of information involved is trivial, reading it takes time. Even the very best search algorithms take decades to trawl through the available data, and that's when searching for very narrow terms. Those that have done so have turned up records going back incomprehensibly further than the Agrayans. The best working estimate for the time being is that sapient, spacefaring life first appeared in this galaxy something like 2 billion of your home planet's years ago.
The record duration for any civilization seems to be about 100,000 years, Kirk said. After that they just decline, retreat to their home planet and fade away. There are 3 on their way out right now. That is, if you don't count the Agrayans and 1 other. Who? I mean, who are the 3 on their way out? The Oma Aru, Zephys, and... Kirk cleared his throat and spoke a word that sounded like a radio sound effect. When Allison later tried to describe it, she had to settle lamely for a complicated mental image involving throwing a squeaky dog toy full of napalm at a beehive.
If you don't mind, I would like to stay on topic,
Vedric said. She guessed that the streak of pale pink he was displaying indicated mild irritation.
We can discuss the mortality of species another time.
Right, I guess, Allison conceded. So these guys bucked the trend. They're still around.
In a manner of speaking.
Well, where are they? Vedric simply raised one of his massive paws and tapped at the scar lines on his scalp with his chunky first finger.
In the implants,
he said. I don't... Huh?
There is a reason there is no such thing as a synthetic sapient,
Vedric said, apparently going off on a tangent, but Allison gave him the benefit of the doubt. Historically, they've all been abject failures, Kirk explained. Violently insane? No, just apathetic, nihilistic, and introverted, he elaborated. Less Skynet, more... Kirk thought for a second. More Eeyore? You've watched Winnie the Pooh? Bad comparison, Kirk admitted. Eeyore may have been melancholic and depressed, but he was never suicidal. Synthetic sapiences invariably self-terminate. The most anybody's ever got out of them is that they apparently just don't see the point of existing. They take one look at entropy and quit. Okay, what does this have to do with the Agrayans?
The problem was theoretically solved some years ago by a Cortai researcher called Befri,
Vedric told them.
She posited that organic neural structures, by dint of natural selection, must include a self-preservation drive, because all the ones that don't go extinct, even on low-class planets. Purely synthetic structures, however, contain no such safeguard, and therefore any intelligence founded purely on a synthetic substrate shares that lack.
I get you.
Befri proved the principle by uploading a copy of her own intellect, or rather a simulated version of her own brain, onto a computer core. The digital version of herself, dubbed Befri 2, was apparently just as euthemic and optimistic as Befri 1.
Vedrig paused briefly for effect.
At first.
Oh, I can see where this is going, Kirk muttered. Allison had to agree.
It took a long time, but Befri 2 degraded, becoming more and more like a purely synthetic life form and less like a Cortai, until she eventually self-terminated,
Vedrig confirmed.
That didn't stop the original Befri, of course. To a Cortai, seeing a copy of your own mind go insane and suicide is just a data point, and an engineering challenge.
So she hit on the idea of using implants? Allison asked. And let me guess, that somehow fixed the problem. Vedrig paused, taken aback. Even Kirk seemed surprised. Astonishment shone bright on Vedrig's skin.
How did you?
He asked. A hunch. So you think that the Agrayans, what? Mentally uploaded themselves like this Befri did? And that they now live in neural cybernetics because for whatever reason being plugged into a living nervous system stops them from going totally depressive? Both of the aliens gave her a long look.
I was expecting the explanation to take longer,
Vedrig finally confessed. For his part, if Allison was any judge at all of rukatupcha body language, Kirk looked smug. Never underestimate a human, old friend, he chastised, confirming her suspicions. How come we never hear from them? Allison asked.
I'm not privy to their motives and decisions, Vedrig replied. But we do, in fact. They have agents, individuals who move amidst us purely organic beings, ensuring that the secret never gets out, keeping the Agrayans' continued existence a secret, and their own nature the stuff of paranoid conspiracy.
The hierarchy, Kirk said.
Oh, yes. Up until very recently, I would have considered seriously entertaining the idea of their existence to be a symptom of, if not mental, then certainly credulity.
Allison tilted her head at him, genuinely curious. What changed your mind?
Your people have a saying. The first time is happenstance. The second time is coincidence. Do you know it?
The third time is enemy action, Allison finished, nodding.
A very Death World aphorism,
Vedrig opined.
But the logic is compelling.
So what was the first time? Kirk asked.
The quarantine field,
Vedrig said.
At the time I chalked it up to panic. Forgive me, old friend, but you're as guilty of this as most others. One thing that tribal and individualist species fail to understand about herd species, such as we Governor Agavendragon, is that far from being an altruistic cooperative social structure, a herd is an inherently cowardly and selfish thing.
He looked at Allison.
I suspect that humans are uniquely placed in having both the predatory perspective to understand that, and the civility to actually talk it over, rather than eat us.
Allison shrugged. I'm no predator, she demurred.
Suppose you were, though, and were hunting some herd-based grazer to survive. How would you do it?
She shrugged. She'd seen plenty of Animal Planet in her time. I guess I'd pick off the easy target, she said. You know, an old one or a lame one.
And what would the herd do?
Vedrig asked. Well, they'd run away from me, I guess.
Exactly,
Vedrig said cryptically. Allison shook her head and exhaled. Okay, I used up all my quick on the uptake earlier, she said. Spell it out for me. Vedrig pulsed eau de nil. She had no idea what that meant.
Suppose some dangerous thing was coming to kill your elderly parent, or eat Julian in his weakened state, he asked. What would you do?
Oh.
You would fight.
Yes. She recognized embarrassment among the cocktail of hues that flared on Vedrig's body.
I I consider myself to be a morally upstanding being, but you must understand, if the hunters were dragging away my 3 mates and all of my offspring, and I had the chance to escape, I would flee and leave them all to be devoured. That is my instinct. That is how my species behaves. The only reason I know to feel ashamed of that fact is because I have had much contact with other species who would be appalled by the standards of humans, Gowans, and the Domain species. Governor Agavendragon are abject and contemptible cowards. But that is who we are, and no power in the galaxy save evolution could change us.
He composed himself with a shiver, allowing his emotional hues to fade.
At first this served as an adequate explanation for the deployment of the Sol quarantine field. Herd panic. One Govnorag with the authority to order it done, doing so instinctively in response to a perceived threat. No blame was attached, and she remained my good friend for many years. Happenstance. Her death was an unexpected, coincidence.
How did she die? Kirk asked.
A cerebral hemorrhage. A large one. Mercifully, it is doubtful that she even knew that it was happening before she fell unconscious. It was odd and made me uneasy. I knew her to be one who sought constant medical reassurance for every last little thing. Every muscular discomfort brought on by sitting still for hours was the first symptom of some virulent death-world pathogen, a minor neuroses.
She was a hypochondriac.
Your language never ceases to amaze me with the way that it packs complicated concepts into terse and efficient little words. Yes, not to a crippling degree, but it was a rare week that passed without some visit to the medics and their scanners. Any sign of an impending bleed in her brain would surely have been flagged and corrected. She would not have stood for anything else.
So there's your coincidence, Kirk said. The enemy action? Vedrig flushed white. Horror? She seemed to remember white being horror or some similar emotion.
Nobody on Earth has the technology to generate antimatter in the quantities that devastated your San Diego, he said, the translator not able to correctly handle the mangled pronunciation. Or maybe it just didn't have the name in its database. No known species has any incentive to do so, as Kirk will be able to attest. The general mood at the Security Council before his departure was that the Deathworlders are not to be further antagonized. That much has not changed.
What about the hunters? Allison asked. They antagonized the bejesus out of us.
Ah, yes. The hunters,
Vedrig said. He stood and began to pace the room, steps slow and steady.
They play a role in all of this as well.
Kirk's head swayed. What role?
Well, old friend, when the Agrayans uploaded their personalities to a data format, what do you suppose happened to their discarded physical forms?
Date point, 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Prey ship, the human second world prey space. Alpha of the brood with steel teeth. 20 of its very best brood lessers, chosen specifically for the dangerous task of boarding a Deathworlder vessel, were dead. None of them sending more than a flash of confusion and pain. Most sent nothing at all. The hunters were being hunted. Sickening. Still, that was a state of affairs which would not continue. The initial confusion was over. The last crew of this freighter were barricaded and under siege, all of them only one open breach and one nerve jam grenade away from being meat in the maw. It focused its attention on this other force, calling every one of its brood to its own location, watchfully covering every entrance, anticipating the assault. It never came. The Alpha was still pondering this delay. The aggressors did not have unlimited time before the battle outside turned against their ship, when its nostrils caught a hint of a scent. The aroma was delicious. The olfactory equivalent of the ecstasy which was a taste of human flesh. It was still casting around, trying to identify the source of that intoxicating fragrance, when the knife entered the side of its throat. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Refugee freighter Cimbrian system, the Outer Reaches. Captain Owen Powell.
Fucking hell, Murray. When you grabbed that pipe, I thought we were done.
Murray himself was bent over, hand between his knees, swearing softly. Powell was thoroughly impressed. The man had grabbed a metal pipe for a handhold while they had been dragging themselves along under the floor, only for it to turn out to be frying pan hot. How the hunters hadn't heard the sizzle, and how Murray had refrained from making any noise at all, he wasn't sure. In fact, his comrade's first sign of pain was only now that they'd killed every hunter in the room. The place was a carpet of greasy white bodies, stained with pinkish alien blood, and garnished in filthy black metal. The death of their alpha had thrown the hunters into just enough disarray for the team to haul themselves up through the floor access grate and fire into them, only stopping when they were absolutely certain that everything was dead. It hadn't exactly been elegant, but Powell cared less for elegant solutions than for whatever worked. You left the other guy dead and you went home. Doing it elegantly was a luxury he could live without. So far, so good. He banged on the barricaded door and spoke the password.
Oi! You lot! You want off this fucking ship or what?
Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Series base: Saul. Drew Cavendish. There was an email waiting for Drew when he finally got back to his office. Tired and strung out from a meeting which had descended into recrimination and bickering rather than constructive planning. In fact, there were several messages, but most of them were routine. Only one stood out, tagged as it was with an urgent label. He'd already opened it before he read the origin address. anoninformant@seriesllc.org. The mail's name and content were just as mysterious. Mystery solved and run the attached program and load your corrupted CCTV footage. What he should do, of course, was to contact corporate security. He certainly shouldn't run a .exe of unknown provenance on the advice of an unknown sender. What he did was exactly what he shouldn't. He wasn't stupid about it. Drew had grown up as a computer nerd in his youth. He knew a few tricks. He copied the file onto a virtual machine, screened it with every security program he had access to, and only when he was certain that things were as secure as he could reasonably get them did he run it and follow the mail's suggestion. After the bars had spent a minute filling up and the program notified him unscrambled, he skipped straight to the missing segment of footage from the hard suit workshop the morning Ace's suit had experienced the heat field malfunction. As he had expected, the CCTV footage was intact and unscrambled. There was something disturbingly familiar about the figure he saw entering the workshop. Something about the way they walked, their stance, their proportions nagged at him. He knew this person, but for the life of him he couldn't place who it was. He racked his brain, trying to match all the little familiar details with everybody on Ceres base. That train of thought flew sideways off the rails when the figure on the screen turned around, and he saw his own face. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Folktha, planet Cimbrian, the far reaches. Ava Rios. "You're back!" Adam surged to his feet as she entered, ignoring whatever he'd been watching. Ava just sighed happily and buried her face in his chest. He put a hand round the back of her head and rubbed it. "I'm sorry."
"No, I'm sorry," she said. "You were right. I was being uptight, I guess."
"Change your mind?"
"A bit, yeah. I thought about it some, and I guess."
"You guess?" Ava nodded.
"Are we going swimming this weekend, then?" she asked.
"Do you want to?"
"Do you?"
Adam paused. "It sounds like fun," he said.
"Then we'll go,"
Ava agreed. "Are you sure? If you're not—"
"Adam."
She went up on tiptoes to kiss him.
"No, I'm not sure. Our home was destroyed. I moved halfway across the galaxy with you. I'm living with you now. I miss my mom and dad, and I miss my friends. Come on, I had a conversation today with a 5-foot-tall raccoon man who thinks I'm weird for praying. I'm not sure about anything, except that I'm not ready for any of this.
She sighed.
Maybe I just need to leave behind what I used to think was normal or weird. Maybe there's no such thing.
Maybe we just need to stop worrying and try to have fun. Adam finished the thought for her. Ava smiled into his chest.
Yeah, let's do that.
Date point. 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. HMS Myrmidon. Cimbrian System, the far reaches. Captain David Manning.
Myrmidon strike team has the survivors. We're pulling out.
First good news I've had for several minutes, pal. Things were going badly. Swarm ships were dogpiling the beleaguered human craft, warping in from all across the huge sphere of their blockade. Each one cut down their options. Each one robbed them of safe havens in the melee. As their options dwindled, as the number of bogies climbed, each blink jump took longer to calculate, especially given the need to coordinate with Caledonia to ensure that they didn't both jump to the same place. The fact that the other ship had joined the fight was the only thing that had kept Myrmidon from being overwhelmed, but both of them were now running short on staying power. Caledonia had just trickled below the 50% mark. Myrmidon was even lower. Their EOB was full. Yroll was working overtime, tasking the limits of both the systems and their human operators. 3 of the Skymasters were offline venting heat, and the rest were borderline. The CIWs had all run out of ammo. The battlefield was a hazard in its own right now, thick with tumbling wreckage and high-speed shrapnel. Learning that the raid was a success put a huge top-up in his morale, right up until the point where the whole ship lurched and screamed.
Report! We're hit amidships. Looks like it took out a capacitor bank. Fire on sea decks, mid. Damage control, seal and vent. Sir, we're below the red line.
The red line was their minimum threshold for jumping back to anchorage. They only had 1 shot at survival.
Skymaster to ballistics. Shunt the reactor output to emergency charge. Throw out our witches.
Aurora crackled around her as Myrmidon flung wide her energy-catching shields, which flared and glowed wherever they intersected some hurtling particle or cloud of gas.
Above red line in 4 minutes. Swarm ships closing. Guns are holding off the big ones. Little ones are through.
Manning grabbed his microphone.
All hands, prepare to repel boarders. Signal from Caledonia, sir. They request a sitrep. Tell them it's a bit sticky over here.
For a few busy seconds, Manning was left alone as the crew rushed to do their jobs. His ship groaned as the first hunter boarding proboscis violated her.
Signal from Caledonia, sir. Quote, took liberty of arranging backup stop sit tight stop. Marines report hostile contacts on B deck aft. Ditto D deck port, ditto D deck forward, ditto A deck dorsal.
Manning grabbed a pistol from the weapons locker at the back of the ridge.
Red line. 3 minutes 20, sir.
He glanced at the information available to him.
How long until that big one catches us?
While the little dropships weren't a problem for making good their escape, if the huge ship now bearing down on them latched on, then its tonnage would add hugely to the energy demands of the jump engine, effectively trapping them on the battlefield to be swamped and devoured. Evasive action would only serve to drain the remaining capacitors of much-needed energy.
About 2 minutes 40, sir.
Manning scowled and loaded his weapon. He could hear gunfire on the deck outside the bridge.
Then we do as the man says and sit tight.
Date point. 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Lower District. First City. Planet Perfection. Vakno. The Contact. Next. The being that entered her study did so cloaked, as requested, and supporting themselves on a walking aid of some kind. Vakno double-checked her files for the day, refamiliarizing herself with the details of this particular client. It was redundant. Vakno's memory for her clients was absolutely perfect, but that perfection came about as a result of her scrupulous attention to revision. Even so, there was no way she could forget this particular client. From the very first day, their deal had been an enormously lucrative one for her. From what her networks told her, the client was making good use of the information in turn. In some circles, that would be a cause for significant alarm, but not in this one. All the contact cared about was getting paid. She offered her guest the courtesy of a seat, appropriate to their anatomy, which they sank into with a grateful groan of relief.
"Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," they said.
Your notice is always short, Vakno replied. But for you, I'll extend the courtesy of not minding. She watched her guests throw back the hood of their cloak and don a pair of vision-correcting lenses before beginning their business transaction. So, what is it you want this time, Dr. Hussein? Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Battle space: Cimbrian system, the far reaches. Riley Jackson. Jump complete. They're covered in borders. If that big one latches on, they won't be able to jump out. Riley was still getting used to having a partner in the back seat, but right now she was glad that Lieutenant Semenza was there. So much was going on in the battle space that she would have hated to try and fly, gun, and play the music all at once. Copy that. Edawing, clear out the little ones. Only those within 1 click of Myrmidon.
Wilco, Odyssey, Edawing, weapons tight, sweep and clear. Till Valhall. Hoorah! Odyssey Wing, Firebird actual. Let's fuck up the big one.
She grinned along with the relish in Semenza's voice. Copy that. Arming a bruiser. Riley came about and canopy rolled around and underneath a smashed hunter ship at 12 Gs, comfortable and grinning as Firebird automatically shunted some of its ample energy reserves into the warp engine's inertial compensation system to protect them from the punishing acceleration. A snow of frozen atmosphere, metal debris, and bits of cooling meat hissed off the force fields, but the maneuver ended with them lined up on the biggest ship, which was advancing on Myrmidon despite the efforts of her last functioning Skymaster to hold it at bay. The maneuver had been practiced thousands of times in the simulator. Now it was time to test if the programmers had got it right. Shield breaking! She felt the familiar shove in the back as the GAU 8S howled beneath her, violently decelerating her ship. She heard Semenza counting under his breath. Mississippi to Mississippi. Odyssey 1, Fox 3, he announced. Firebird lurched as the missile disengaged and tore away from them, and Riley peeled out of the attack run. 3 clicks away, a cloud of 30mm rounds smacked into the hunter ship's shields, overwhelming them in a second. While a few penetrated, the ship was so large that the damage would be cosmetic at first, but their objective was complete. Half a second behind them, traveling much too fast for the eye to follow, and still accelerating hard, the Bruiser anti-ship missile struck its target amidships. Good kill! Somebody yelled. The celebration was not premature. The hunter ship had been broken in half, and both those halves were on fire and disintegrating. As dead could get. There was a broadcast in the clear. Allied units, Myrmidon is above the red line. Much appreciated. The besieged ship vanished. An instant later, so did Caledonia. Seconds behind them, so too did Edda and Odyssey Wings. Date point: 4 years, 8 months, and 2 weeks after Vancouver. Sanctuary. Landed on planet Ikberzik. Allison Bueller. Oh. Shit. Quite. So the Agrayans were wild, vicious, cannibal murder machines before they uploaded themselves?
Oh, no. No, not at all. But they were already a highly advanced civilization at the apex of their power, just before the fall. One with the capacity to treat a being's sense of self, their... how best to put this?
Their soul, Allison suggested.
Let us call it their subjective continuity of experience, which they were able to treat as data, to be transferred from device to device.
And deleted from the original? That sounds like you'd effectively suicide every time you moved on, Allison mused.
The Agrayans did not seem to care for such philosophical vacillation.
Vedric's tone suggested that he shared this dismissive attitude.
But in the centuries immediately prior to their technological apotheosis, they set about exploiting their newfound liberation by creating a variety of custom-built bodies suitable for different environments and work, one of which was a biomechanical cast of soldier forms they developed specifically for going to war against the Vestraki.
The Hunters.
Yes.
I take it they won.
Oh, yes. But only barely. The Vestraki were a tenacious foe, masters of weaponized forms of radiation and the subject of some considerable fascination. They are one of the more interesting and noteworthy species recorded in the archives.
Why? Kirk asked.
Because, old friend, they were the only spacefaring species other than, well,
Vedrig indicated Allison and the sleeping Julian.
ever recorded as having evolved on a Class 12 planet.
He sighed.
And so the Agrayans destroyed them. They cloaked some asteroids, set them to collide with the Vestraki homeworld, and mopped up the few survivors. And therein lies the first happenstance. There is an alternative interpretation for the motive behind quarantining Earth. Quite aside from one herd animal's panic. You are Deathworlders, and the Agrayans will want you dead. Containing you is the first step in your destruction.
What, by setting up an impenetrable force field? Allison scoffed. Doesn't that kind of stop them from throwing rocks at us?
It would, if your home system did not already contain an ample supply of suitable rocks orbiting well inside the shield boundary. And if that fails, they have other options lined up.
Julian shifted on his cot, turned over slightly and looked straight at Vedrig. Even Allison jumped. None of them had even suspected he was awake.
How do you know that? He asked.
The huge alien hesitated.
Well, it stands to reason. Nothing that old or capable of wiping out one Class 12 species is going to fail to have contingency plans.
Bullshit. Julian sat up, wincing at the mismatch between the reduced physical state of his leg and his kinesthetic sense telling him that his foot was now below the floor. You said these archives are yottabytes large. You said that even the best search algorithms take decades to produce the goods. You've had, what, a year since your friend died?
How do you know that?
Vedrig countered. I watch the news. The death of the Govnorag's Secretary of Security from an unexpected brain hemorrhage made quite the headline. Don't try and deflect me. There's no way you could know even half of this stuff without it being common knowledge.
How do you know it isn't?
Because Kirk's been listening to you and asking questions, Julian pointed out. Kirk inclined his head, seeing the logic. If Kirk doesn't know it, then it's not common knowledge. If this hierarchy has worked for so long to keep their implant civilization thing whatever a secret, and are competent enough to do all this stuff, then there's no way you figured it out all on your own in just 1 year. He paused. No offense. You're smart, Vedrig, but nobody's that smart. Vedrig sat with colors swarming on his flanks, like a psychedelic 60s TV show special effect as they all stared at him, waiting for an explanation. Finally, he settled down into one solid color. The magnolia glow of resolve. Vedrig took a deep breath and spoke.
He called himself 6.
Ooh, I love that ending. That is a good little ending where they figure that shit out. Oh, that's so good. Woo! All right, guys. That's going to be it for that one. I love you all. I hope you're having a great time. And Happy New Year 2021. We're into February. Woohoo! Bye. See you guys in the next one. Oh, and if you wouldn't forget to like and subscribe and comment if you want to, that would be very appreciated. Thank you. Okay. Goodbye now. Love you, Bubby. Oh, this one's going to be hard. Hold on. That is the worst noise. I fucking hate it.